Cathaoirleach, and firstly I just want to say, as a member of the Joint Oireachtas Housing Committee and also a member of the Business Committee, my understanding from our discussions at the Oireachtas Housing Committee is that the members of the committee are more than happy to meet next week for 6, 7, 8, 9 hours, whatever amount of time it takes to go through these amendments in detail and scrutinise them to make sure we can get the best bill possible, and that members of the committee will make themselves available to do that. That proposal was discussed earlier this morning at the Business Committee. There was no objection to it from anyone at the Business Committee. The Business Committee, there was a very strong view from a lot of the groups and parties represented there that there should be proper time next week to go through the amendments. The Government Chief Whip committed to checking with the Department and the Minister to see if that would be okay. So all we need next week to get to 6, 7, 8, 9 hours, whatever it takes, to discuss these amendments properly, to ensure the best bill possible, all we need is for the Minister to okay it. So I would ask you, Minister, and I would really urge you, Minister, to okay it, because if you okay it, we can give the 6, 7, 8, 9 hours next week needed at the Joint Oireachtas Housing Committee to go through this bill in detail, discuss all these amendments. So I'm really urging you, Minister, to give that okay, give that green light so we can go ahead and do the justice to this bill that is needed. And a lot of work has gone into it, so it's very important that we get it right and that we don't fall short on time at this stage. So that is entirely down to you, Minister, to give it the okay. There's no objection from any other quarters that I'm aware of. I do think, Cathaoirleach, it's important when we're discussing this bill. I just want to recall the very recent words of our President, Michael D. Higgins, when he was talking about housing, and I want to quote, and he said, "There is a powerful word, home, home. Home is about the outpouring of intimacies and emotions. Sometimes it is only a very simple thing, but it's where personalities are developed, where relationships with others are developed. It is a place to come back to, a place to depart from." And when we talk about this bill and defective blocks, and we talk about crumbling buildings, we're talking about people's homes, we're talking about a place where families seek shelter, seek refuge. It's a place that they invest hugely in terms of their lives and their emotions into creating a home. It's more than a building. And when the place that people call home becomes unsafe, the place that is their refuge, and they don't have somewhere to go back to from that stress, it creates huge pressures and puts people under immense and severe pressure, and you can have all the fallout from that, all the mental health problems and everything else that other deputies and ministers have talked about. In terms of this bill, and the government is bringing forward a bill for a remediation scheme that at their estimate is going to cost £2.75 billion. I think there's 4 things that we, at the very least, should be able to expect from that. We'd expect that there be proper scrutiny of the bill. We would expect that every effort would be made to recover costs and go after those responsible. We would expect that not a single quarry would continue to operate that is producing substandard materials that leads to people's homes crumbling. And we'd expect that every measure necessary is put in place to ensure that this never, ever happens again. And that's not too much for anyone to expect. Now, what's happening in terms of scrutiny of this bill as we speak, but as I said, the Minister can change this, the Minister can decide to change this, but as we speak, only 2 hours is being allotted next week for committee and remaining stages in this, which means that we will not be able to give this to scrutiny and put forward the proposals to improve and change that are needed, and indeed to hear the Minister's response on that. The deadline for amendments on this bill was 11 a.m. today before we even began a second stage, which is not following proper process. We have the use of the guillotine on this bill. The legislation is being rammed through in measures that are utterly unacceptable. And there's a pattern that we have seen here now coming from this particular minister, that when it comes to non-contentious legislation, like the first parts of the electoral reform bill, for example, that there was a lot of consensus in this House on, when it comes to that sort of legislation, we are given ample time to discuss it at committee, in the Dáil, to go through the different amendments. But when it comes to complex legislation, contentious legislation, legislation that needs proper scrutiny and needs to be given detailed scrutiny. We're seeing the amount of time shoehorned into impossible amounts of time for it to be given the attention that it needs. And we know from previous experience that rushed legislation is bad legislation. So I'm again appealing to the Minister. The one person can remove the obstacles to the Housing Committee having 9 hours or whatever amount of time it takes next week to go through this at committee stage, and that's you. So I'm appealing to you to actually agree to that, because nobody else has objected to it. The timelines that have been imposed here mean that affected homeowners have not had a chance to study the bill in detail and make the suggestions and give feedback that they would like to. And we have had the situation where, and we've heard the statement before earlier from affected homeowners, and affected homeowners have engaged over the last year and number of months in good faith and worked through in detail a number of different issues, and they're deeply concerned and disappointed and hugely frustrated that the work that they've done is not reflected in this bill. And in fairness, they did put their hearts and souls into that process. One of the other areas that we should expect on this bill for everything possible to be done is for the government to do everything it can to hold those responsible to account. The government must hold big industry to account and responsible for this disaster. The full cost of remediation must be recovered. The Minister has been vocal on the issue of recovering costs and has made plenty of statements about this. But at the moment, we still haven't seen anything actually done on this. And the current situation is that some large Irish construction companies are contributing to a UK redress schemes arising out of the Grenfell Tower disaster and the cladding issues there, but they're not being, the equivalent is not being, companies are not being held to account in Ireland at this point. And in terms of what way this is done, I think it's very important that there isn't measures that punish the entire sector, because that would punish people who have complied with all the standards. It must be about holding to account those that are responsible. And I think that's really important if we're actually going to have accountability built into this. We learned last Thursday at the Housing Committee, and the Minister said it in his opening statements here as well, that the government does intend to do something about it. There's an intention to appoint a senior counsel to look into cost recovery, but incredibly, terms of reference for this piece of work has still not yet been drawn up, and no one has of yet been appointed. And there is an urgency, of course, here, because statute of limitations will kick in and will prevent action being taken after a certain amount of time. And there's a 10-year window on that, as we know, and there are instances now where that 10-year window is going to start to kick in quite soon. So I think that tells us everything we need to know about the level of urgency that the government is placing on recovering costs from those who are responsible. I have to say the government, in my view, has been negligent with respect to rogue quarries that are still operating. We were told last Thursday in the Housing Committee by Cian O'Callaghan, who's an experienced and qualified engineer, and I will quote, he says, we have experience of 12 counties where we've seen damage. As of last week, we are now on county 13. There was a substantial amount of properties to be inspecting, reviewing and so forth. One of the difficulties we're having, and I understand this is a public forum, is that the quarry owners recognise they have a problem and are suppressing some of the information and some of the damage and doing side deals with homeowners trying to suppress it within the counties. Ultimately, I believe where all these locations are will come out. I encourage people and deputies who have knowledge of affected quarries, because I'm aware of some areas in the southern part of Ireland and on the south east coast where there are affected properties, and they probably are well aware of where the materials have come from, to come forward and give that information to the National Standards Authority of Ireland or Engineers Ireland. He went on to say, I do know certain quarries that are still producing concrete blocks and material that is wholly unsatisfactory, and they continue to do it knowing that material is still wholly unsatisfactory. I believe that some TDs and other public personnel do know that themselves, and I encourage them to try to use any of their authority to get it stopped. Now that's an incredible statement that we heard, and I'm quite frankly very disappointed that the Minister didn't address this in your opening remarks. You did say that you were ordered an audit of all active quarries in Donegal. But what about the other quarries that we know, certainly as of last Thursday, that are operating around the country? I've been in touch, as I know others have, with the National Building Control Office about that, urging them to act on this. But why is the Minister not acting on this? Why did you not address this in your opening statement? Why are quarries still operating in Ireland now, today, producing substandard material, leading to crumbling houses and putting families, communities through all of that stress? And what are you doing about it? And why are we not hearing from you about what you're doing about it? I think everybody in Ireland deserves to hear from you about what you're doing about these quarries that are still operating doing this. It's utterly unacceptable, and it's utterly unacceptable that you, as Minister with responsibility for this, had nothing to say about it in your opening statement today. So I hope you do in your closing statement. I would urge you to do that. In terms of making sure this never happens again, there's 4 things that the government should do as a matter of urgency. We need a national building control authority along the lines of the National Food Safety Authority. We need to make the inspection and certification of building and development properly independent, completely break the self-certification model, which has been an absolute disaster. We need to bring in latent defects insurance, and the government opposed my recent amendments on legislation to do this. And we need an independent regulator of the building industry, not one that is run by the building industry itself, which is what the Minister is doing. And given the huge costs, stress and trauma caused by building defects, defective blocks, it is absolutely inexcusable that these measures have not been taken already. In terms of the bill, I just want to touch on the assignment and subrogation of claims to Minister in Head 29. This means homeowners will not be able to take legal actions if they sign up to the State's redress scheme. We know that so far 34 High Court writs have been issued, and we know that hundreds more could be expected. And would it not be in the State's interest to allow homeowners to recover costs against third parties, especially for non-grantable losses, or any of the costs of construction remediation that will not be covered by this scheme? It appears that this section of the bill will prevent homeowners recovering those costs through legal action, and we need to know on what basis does the State purport to inherit plaintiffs' rights to recover sums that are not covered by the grants for which third parties could otherwise be liable. I asked about this at the Oireachtas Housing Committee last Thursday to officials from the department. We were promised an answer on this, haven't received any answer. And this is one of the problems with rushing this through, is that we raise legitimate questions, as we are meant to do as part of the democratic process, and we don't get answers. That is a deficit in this process. Does blocking these legal actions mean that people who are not covered under the scheme could in fact end up in a situation in terms of taking legal cases? They get financial recourse before thousands of homeowners. Was said last week at the committee, representatives of affected homeowners did state that they felt that this part of the legislation was designed to put the frighteners on them and to stop people pursuing a claim against anyone. And it was noted that while there's these measures in the bill to prevent affected homeowners from taking legal action, there's no such measures with respect to taking on those who are actually responsible for this disaster. Others have mentioned the option of penalty-free downsizing, which I have to say I think is a very good proposal, a very good suggestion that was put forward as a compromise by affected homeowners. Again, we haven't heard a good explanation as to why this isn't being provided for. This does make sense. It makes sense in terms of the environmental benefits, both in terms of reduced building materials that would have to go in, less energy to heat homes. It's in line with government policy in terms of tackling climate change. So I would ask the government to consider allowing for penalty-free downsizing and allowing for flexibility in that. To me, it makes imminent sense to do so. In terms of the damage threshold, I'm concerned that this will potentially exclude and potentially delay thousands in pyrite impacted counties, that the reliance on visual inspections and assessment of photographs will mean that some homeowners will be excluded. It means that the core testing will only apply if homeowners pass the damage threshold. And there is concerns that were articulated last week that could mean that homeowners who have understandably taken some very small measures, for example, to prevent additional water egress and the damage that causes, that they may not meet the damage threshold as a result of those very small measures that they've taken. The approach that should be taken should be scientific, should be evidence-based, and should rely on core testing. So I just want to repeat that line. The approach should be scientific, evidence-based, and should rely on core testing. I don't think there's anything controversial about taking that approach. So why is that approach not being taken? Why are we not relying on core testing in terms of the damage threshold? In terms of, and there's a number of different issues with the bill, and I've submitted, along with others, I've submitted a large number of amendments to it. Some of the other issues that I want to raise with it is have concerns that the revised rates are not in line with the inflation forecast in terms of rates and caps, and the proposals for dealing with cost inflation are inadequate in the bill. Have concerns that the approach taken is not following the science. It's not ensuring that all deleterious materials are assessed and that the foundations are tested too. We were told last Thursday at the Housing Committee that the Housing Agency, for example, has not done any testing of foundations in Donegal. So why is that the case? Why have they not done any testing at this point? And why is there that aversion to taking a scientific and evidence-based approach on that? And why are we not taking an approach which means that no defective concrete block homeowner is left behind? Other concerns are that the approval process is complex, that there's so many stages in it that will not be user-friendly, and we have to think of this in terms of the stress and the trauma that homeowners have already gone through, and making those processes more difficult for them does not help. There are concerns in terms of the bill and the amount of power and discretion that are put in the hands of the Minister in terms of setting regulations without scrutiny, and there are concerns that in terms of the 18-month time limit that may cause issues with accessing contractors and builders, especially in areas of high demand. In conclusion, Cathaoirleach, I want to say it's very important that we get this legislation right, that rushing it does not help in that regard at all. There must be accountability and recovery of costs from those who are responsible, and the lack of action on that to date is, in my mind, absolutely and utterly unforgivable. The rogue quarries producing substandard materials which are damaging homes and damaging lives to this day need to be shut down and dealt with. And it's utterly unacceptable that the government are not acting on that. There needs to be action now to ensure that this sector, the construction sector, is independently regulated and robustly regulated to ensure that things like this never ever happen again. And yet we still see, and the final passage through the Houses is happening on the construction industry regulation bill, which means that it won't be independently regulated. It will be regulated. It will be the industry regulating itself, which is incredible. After everything that's happened in this country, it is an incredible thing for this government to be doing. Before concluding, I just want to say I agree with the comments of Deputy Nash in terms of the proposal from Construction Defects Alliance. And I think we need to see action on that in this year's budget, and I hope the Minister addresses that in his concluding remarks. And finally, just want to reiterate, we can give this bill the justice it deserves, the scrutiny it deserves, the time that the amendments are needed, if one person, the Minister for Housing, will facilitate that and agree to that. Nobody else has objected to it. Gurv Mágat.